Well, good evening to everyone. We have a great crowd here tonight for our midweek service, and we're certainly thankful for the presence of everyone that's been able to come out and join us for our worship service. Appreciate the songs and the prayers very much, and I hope that the study tonight will be helpful for all of us. Back at the very beginning of summer, I think in late May or early June or somewhere around that time frame, I gave a sermon on a Wednesday night, and I'd mentioned that I was going to try and use some Wednesday nights for the foreseeable future when I speak on a Wednesday night to do some more basic Bible overview type sermons. That sermon is out on the website if you want to go back and refresh on that sermon if you want to, but it was more of an entire Bible overview. We talked about the main theme or the main story of the Bible. We especially looked at the theme of God's promise from all the way in the beginning after the fall of man, how Jesus was the fulfillment of that promise and the promise that Jesus provides us for eternity, and we kind of looked at the major dispensations of the Bible. And so tonight we're going to continue with our kind of survey style of sermons and Bible overview, but we're going to focus on the Old Testament and specifically on the history of the Old Testament. So we'll go over some of the events. We're not going to get in depth, obviously, on any of the particulars, but we're going to cover just a basic overview of the Old Testament. I think that this is helpful. I know things like this are helpful for me because sometimes to understand the details of something, it helps to see the bigger picture first. That's true when we're studying just a book of the Bible. Sometimes we want to get straight into the details, but it can help us to have an outline and a bigger picture of the book and the theme of a book, and then we can begin to learn more about the details that make that book up and how they fit into that theme. And so as we know more about the Bible as a whole, and as we know more about the Old Testament as a whole, I think it helps us as we then approach individual and specific books to talk about the Old Testament. So the way we're going to frame that tonight, I'll go over just some real basic information. We're going to talk a little bit about the geography of the Old Testament, not spend a whole lot of time on that, but then mainly we're going to talk about the eras of the Old Testament. And what this is meant to do is to help us see a historical outline of the Old Testament. Now, if you look at or read different Bible surveys, you might see a few different ways of outlining the Old Testament. This is the way I learned it. I learned it this way when I was a kid, and it helped me make sense of the Old Testament history and timeline, and it has stuck with me ever since. And so that's what I'm going to go through tonight. I hope that it helps you. If you see another way or you've learned another way, that's perfectly fine. There are some variations of this, but that's what we're going to go through tonight. So as we start off with, and we talk about the history of the Old Testament, when you start in Genesis and when you get through the Old Testament, in fact, really when you get not even halfway through the Old Testament, you cover a period of over 4,000 years of history. Well, that's an amazing thing to think of the Bible. Obviously, it's inspired of God, but even just as a historical document, the Bible is an incredible thing. And the Old Testament covers a huge swath of history. Now, the purpose of the Bible is not to be a history textbook, but because it is a book about real people in real life and real events, it does happen to be a book of history also, and it covers a great span of history. And we're going to see how that history comes together tonight. As I said, just briefly, it helps to have an understanding of the geography. Many of the names that we read about and that we encounter as we go through the Old Testament, they're places that we're not familiar with. They're places that we don't really know. And when it talks about Babylon or Assyria, where are those places? And some people don't care about geography at all. Some people, like me, really enjoy being able to actually picture the geography of what's taking place. And so this map lines out for us or shows us some of the major nations and the geography. Now, I didn't put this, but this whole area, this is the Euphrates River and the Tigris River. These are two major rivers. In fact, we read about them all the way back in the beginning in Genesis. But this whole area is known as Mesopotamia. And so if you hear or read about Mesopotamia, it's speaking about this general region here. Now, as history developed and as time went on, the northern area ended up becoming the nation of Assyria. And so when we read about the Assyrians and the Assyrian captivity, is these people that are up here. Now Syria, you read about Syria when you read about Damascus. That's the capital city of Syria. You're going to read about some of the battles between the kings of Israel and the kings of Syria. That's this region just across the river Euphrates from Assyria. Of course, Babylon, Babel and Ur of the Chaldees. Chaldea and Babylonia are roughly the same geographical area, but that's a prominent player in the Old Testament. Of course, Media and Persia, which become the Medo-Persian Empire, and that extends far off. What we see here are further east. Of course, this area, what we're probably most familiar with, there's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea, and this smaller area right here is the area of Canaan. Of course, the Israelites go there. That's the Promised Land, and it becomes Israel. In New Testament times, it will be known as Palestine. And then down to the southwest, of course, is the nation in the area of Egypt. And so this just visualizes where these places are when we read. And we won't make many more comments about the geography. There will be some information on the slides, but it's helpful to know this because the different books of the Bible record some of the movement of God's people from place to place. For example, the creation we don't know exactly where the Garden of Eden was, but it was probably somewhere in Mesopotamia. And then when we get to Abraham, he's down in Ur of the Chaldees, and he moves up to northern Mesopotamia and comes down to Canaan. And then, of course, at the end of Genesis, God's people are down in Egypt. And so there's geographical movement throughout the Old Testament, and understanding where these places are helps us make sense of that. Now, just some basic information about the Old Testament. It was written by at least 30 different men. Now, a lot of these men are the writing prophets that you find in the latter portion of the Old Testament. Some of them are men that write just a small section like we saw in the book of Psalms. There are men that are attributed with just one psalm or a handful of psalms, and so they are authors or contributors to the Old Testament. Of course, some of the major writers are Moses and Samuel and David and Solomon, and then you have individuals that write. But we know that the author, of course, is God. But God used around 30 penmen at least to help put together the Old Testament. And of course, what that equals out to, or what that comes out to, is the Old Testament is made up of 39 books. And so you have 39. From Genesis to Malachi, there are 39 books. Now, to help us kind of outline that, it's helpful to realize that not all of the books are the same. You open up Genesis and you start reading Genesis, and it's easy to read because it's interesting. It's a story. It's narrative. And you get through more books that are story and narrative, but not all the books of the Old Testament are historical narrative like that. And so knowing how the Bible puts together, one, helps us make sense of it, and two, to me, it helps me remember where things are. I remember as a kid, this was very helpful to me because when someone says a book of the Old Testament and you're trying to thumb through and find which out of the 39, if you remember this outline, it will help you remember where things are in the Bible, in the Old Testament. So there are 5 books of law. Those are the first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes called the Torah or the Pentateuch. So that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. Now they are historical as well in nature, and so they kind of are books of history, but they are especially set aside as the books of the law. After that, you have 12 books of history. That's the Hebrew history, and that begins, of course, in the book of Joshua and goes through Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. So those are the books of history. After that, you have 5 books of poetry and wisdom. These are the books like Psalms and Job and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. Very different. They are not historical narratives. They are wisdom literature, poetic literature. In fact, we've begun studying the Psalms. Falls in there. And then the last 17 books of the Bible are the books of prophecy. And these are divided up into major and minor prophets. The first 5 are the major prophets. These are works like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Lamentations, Daniel, and Ezekiel. They're not major because they're more important. They're major because they're bigger, because they're longer. Isaiah is 66 chapters. Jeremiah is not 66 chapters, but by word count in the original Hebrew is actually the longest book in the Bible. And so these books are longer books. Whereas when you get to the minor prophets, there's some of them that are only 1 chapter or 2 or 3 chapters. So they're shorter works. So they're known as the minor prophets. But if you can just remember 3 numbers, if you can remember the numbers 5, 12, and 17. In fact, if you really just remember 5 and 12, you can remember the outline. You've got 5 books of law, 12 books of history, 5 books of poetry, 5 books of the major prophets, 12 books of the minor prophets. And that's the Old Testament. Now, as far as how these all fit together in history, this is what we're going to spend most of our time on. There are 8 eras. And again, some people divide this up into a few more, but this is the way I've learned it. This is the way that makes a lot of sense to me. And we'll talk about some of the maybe subdivisions. You can look at this. But there are essentially 8 eras, 8 historical eras in the Old Testament. That begins with the creation. You've got the patriarch era, the Exodus era, conquest, judges, kingdom, captivity, and then the return era. And so we're just going to go through these and see what takes place in these at a very high level. And so that way we can have a little bit of an overview of the Old Testament. So the creation era, of course, obviously that begins in Genesis chapter 1. And this really is the opening section of the Bible. And Genesis 1 through 11, even though this is not just about creation, but we just put that heading on it. But these first 11 chapters cover the largest chunk of history in the Bible. So over 2,000 years of history are crammed into 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. So since then, there's only been about 4,000 or 5,000 more years of history in the world's history. So there's a lot of history just in these 11 chapters. And what you can remember, the thing to remember about this is there are 4 major events that are covered in these first 11 chapters of the Bible. Of course, first of all, there's creation. Genesis 1 and Genesis chapter 2, they tell us how everything began. They tell us how God created the world, how God spoke everything into existence. But then you get into Genesis chapter 3 and you have the next major event. Of course, that is the fall of mankind. Satan comes in the form of a serpent. He tempts Eve, and Eve and Adam partake of that forbidden fruit. And so you have God has created this paradise, this perfect world for mankind, and yet man chooses sin and rebellion. And so there is a fall from the grace of God. There's a fall from that perfect state. And as we saw back when we talked about the whole Bible, this is where Genesis 3:15, God promises that there's going to be the seed of woman that crushes the head of the serpent. That's a messianic prophecy. And so from this major event forward is the rest of the biblical story. There's a couple other big events. One we know very well, the flood. There's a few chapters in this section that tell us about how evil mankind gets. The thoughts of his heart are only evil continually. And so God determines to destroy the world in a flood. Of course, Noah finds grace in the sight of God, and Noah is obedient to God. So despite the wicked world around him, Noah seeks to be righteous. He seeks to be like God, to follow God. And so through Noah and his family, the world is literally saved through those 8 souls that are saved on the ark. And then the last is the Tower of Babel, an important story, not just interesting, neat little story, but an important story at the end of this first era of biblical history about the Tower of Babel. Mankind is not fulfilling God's command. In fact, mankind, it seems to be, is becoming idolatrous once again. They're building this tower to the heavens, and God comes down and confuses the languages so that man does what God had told man to do, and that is to disperse and to fill the earth as man was supposed to do. Now here, the Bible takes a major shift. From Genesis chapter 1 through 11, the purview of the Bible is the whole world. We're talking about the creation. And even though it's only 2 people that are involved in the fall, they're the 2 people that are alive at the time. And so it's a worldwide fall, and it's going to have worldwide consequences. The flood has to do with the whole world. The Tower of Babel has to do with at least a majority of the people of the earth. But then in Genesis chapter 12, we come to the next era, and that is the patriarch era. And the Bible story zooms way in. Instead of focusing on the world, the Bible now focuses on how God is going to bless the world and save the world, and it's going to begin with the family of one man. Of course, that's going to be Abraham. And so the first part of Genesis, Genesis 1 through 11, talks about 4 major events The second part of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, this patriarch era, talks about 4 people. So that's a really easy outline to remember about Genesis. 1 through 11, 4 events. 12 through 50, 4 people. Of course, those people are Abraham, to whom God calls to the land of Canaan, and God makes his promises to Abraham. We talked about that in our Bible overview, the promises that God makes to Abraham. It was through him that all of the world would be blessed. So God had promised the seed of woman. That narrows down. We now know that the seed of woman is going to come from the lineage of Abraham, and that's going to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. Then we learn a little bit about his son Isaac, who is the child of promise, his son Jacob, who is also renamed Israel, and of course his 12 sons, who will become the 12 tribes of Israel. And then the last character in the book of Genesis is, of course, Joseph, and the wonderful story. And as tempting as it is for me to talk about each of these men, we can't, because this is an overview. But these are some incredible stories and wonderful things that are taking place in the patriarch era. But of course we know Joseph, he's sold into slavery, but he rises to the second most powerful man in the world, and that's all by God's design so that he can save his family from famine. And they are brought to Egypt during those years of famine, but it is there in Egypt that the book of Genesis ends. And then we open up the next period of Hebrew history or biblical history, and that is the Exodus era. And Exodus means to depart, to go out, to exit. And that's important because hundreds of years have passed from Joseph's time, and the Israelites are no longer welcomed guests like they were in Egypt. They are now the slaves of Pharaoh and the Egyptian people. And yet, just as God had promised Abraham 400 plus years earlier, he is going to bring them out, and there's going to be a great exodus, a great deliverance of God's people. And so this is going to be a major theme throughout all the Bible, is God's deliverance of his people. That's going to be a major recurrence when they're brought back from Babylonian captivity. And then, of course, Jesus is going to be the one who Moses really pointed forward to. Jesus is going to provide the real exodus, and that is a deliverance from the bondage of sin. But this is where that theme of deliverance begins, is in this Exodus era. So, of course, we have the book of Exodus, which actually tells the story of the deliverance. It's during this time period that Abraham's descendants have become a nation. Jacob's 12 sons have developed into 12 tribes of hundreds of thousands of people. The nation could be as big as 2 or 3 million people by this point. And so they are now a nation. They are truly a nation. But as a nation, they must be ruled by God's law. And Leviticus gives us that law. Numbers tells the story of their failure to take the promised land as they should have. So it tells us of the wilderness wanderings. And the old generation dies out. The new generation rises up. And Deuteronomy is the covenant being renewed with that new generation, somewhat of a retelling of the law before the nation goes in to the promised land. And that brings us to the third area. So Exodus through Deuteronomy, they fall into this Exodus era. And that completes the first 5 books of the Bible that we talked about, those 5 books of law, or the Pentateuch. Well, that brings us to the next era. And this is a very short era compared to the rest of the eras that we look at, but this is the conquest era. And this is the book of Joshua that tells us about this. Remember, this is the new nation that has risen up. They've grown up in the wilderness. Moses passes away. Joshua is chosen to assume the mantle of leadership, and Joshua leads the people through the conquest of the promised land. Again, God had promised the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants, but it was filled with the Canaanites and all sorts of evil people. And part of the conquering of this land was also God's judgment on those people because they were sinful, evil, immoral, wicked people. And so this was to be Abraham's descendants' land, and these people had proven very unfaithful to God and had been evil. And so God executes judgment on them through his chosen nation of Israel. And Joshua is the one who takes charge. So they conquer the promised land. You can read about that through the book of Joshua. You can read about the allotment of inheritances. So where all the tribes end up placed in the land of Canaan, that's all allotted there in the book of Joshua. And one interesting thing about this, of all the Old Testament books, or at least of primary history, this is the most successful era. In fact, now people talk about Solomon's reign was the golden age of Israel, and that was when Israel was probably the wealthiest and the largest and the biggest. But even during Solomon's reign, of course, Solomon's heart was turned away from God, and Solomon turned to idolatry. But the time period of the conquest could really be called the golden age of Hebrew history. In fact, there's only a couple of failures that are mentioned. One seems to be a big failure, but it's one man and his greed. And there's one occasion where Joshua and the leaders allow themselves to be tricked into a truce. But in Joshua, you don't read any major failures by the nation, and that's pretty rare for the history of the Israelites. And so this is a very successful area. They are very obedient to God. They listened to God's law, unlike their forefathers who complained and they wanted to go back to Egypt and they doubted in God. This group of people trust in God, obey God, and they are the most successful generation pretty much in Hebrew history. Now, the sad part about that is they are followed by really you could call the Judges period the Dark Ages of Hebrew history. And so Judges and Ruth are the two books that cover this time period. And it's hard to tell. There's different ideas. If you just look chronologically, if you just add up the dates, this period of time could have been around 400 years. Some commentators think that the judges actually overlapped and may have been judging in different parts of Israel at the same time. And if that's the case, this period could have been as short as 150 years or somewhere in between that time frame. But this is after the death of Joshua and the men that led Israel with him, but before there are kings in the land of Israel. And it tells us the story in these cycles. And what that cycle is Israel is obedient to God for a time, but then Israel turns away from God and they follow the ways of their neighbors. They become immoral. They become idolatrous. And because of their evil and their sin, God sends punishment, whether that be famine or and other pestilence and typically foreign invasion. They end up being under the yoke of the Moabites or under the Philistines. And so there will be these foreign invaders, these foreign oppressors that afflict the nation and the people for a period of time until they finally repent. And after they repent and they turn back to God, God raises up a judge. And that's not a judge in a legal sense. That judge would become a military victor. In fact, many of the judges are not shining examples of great godly character. For example, Samson. Samson had a lot of spiritual problems, but God used Samson to begin the deliverance of the people from the yoke of the Philistines. And there's 12 of these judges that we're told about. Some of them, like Samson and Gideon, are major Bible characters that we know very much about. Some of them are very minor characters, but all we're told is they were a judge over Israel, and that's all that we really know about them. So we're told the story of Judges. But the end of Judges ends with this verse. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And that's a very powerful, powerful verse. Because if you want to read some of the most depressing material in the Bible, read the last few chapters of Judges. It will literally make you cringe and your skin crawl what some of the people in Israel did and the lows that they stooped to during the period of the Judges. It really was the dark ages of Hebrew history. And then you look at this prognosis. Why did it get that way? Because instead of listening to God, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Sound familiar? Does it sound a little bit like Western culture? We should learn from the book of Judges. But no, it's not okay to just make our own way. No, it's not okay to just do what's right for me and you do what's right for you. You know what happens when mankind just does what's right in his own eyes? Rebellion, and chaos, and terror, and sin. And that's what happened to the Hebrew people. God's chosen nation suffered because of that. Now, that being said, one of the most beautiful books of the Bible does take place in the Judges era, and that's the book of Ruth. And that reminds us that just like Noah, who was vastly outnumbered by wicked people, even in the darkest of days, when people are obedient to God, they can still live good, godly, righteous lives. And Ruth and Boaz and Naomi are a beautiful story, and that should be an encouragement to us that even when our culture seems to be getting worse and worse, that's okay, because we can still be faithful to God. We can still rely on Him and follow His word. So after the Judges era comes the kingdom era, or you might call this the monarchy era. Of course, we know the Samuel functions as the last judge. Samuel was made a judge in Israel, but as he grew old, his sons were not very good men, apparently, and the nation said to Samuel, "We don't want your sons to judge over us, but we want a king." Now that might sound legitimate. Well, his sons are not good people and they don't want that. But then they say, we've actually decided that we want a king because we want someone to fight our battles for us and we want to be like all the nations around us. As they looked around them and they saw these other nations and their neighbors, they all had a king. And they kind of got sad that we don't have a king. Well, they did have a king. They had God. That's not good enough for them. They want a king like the rest of the nations. That's a lesson right there. We shouldn't want to be like our neighbors. We shouldn't want to be like the people around us. That's not God's plan. But these people, they wanted a king. Samuel was very upset, but God said, no, we're going to give them a king. And this ushered in a new age in Hebrew history that would be the way all the way up until the captivity, and that's this kingdom era. Now there's two, and this is where you find deviations, because there's really two periods of time in this kingdom era. So some outlines, you'll see this kingdom era broken up into these two. First of all, you have the United Kingdom. So Saul and David and Solomon, each of them reigned for about 40 years, and they reigned over a united Israel. Now David, it took about 7.5 years. There was civil war when he became king, and for a while it was divided, but within about 7 years, the kingdom was united again under David and grew. And so Saul and David and Solomon, they all reign over all 12 tribes as one united kingdom. But during Solomon's reign, remember, Solomon's heart is turned away from God, and God tells Solomon that it won't happen in his lifetime, but during the reign of his son, because of his sin and rebellion, a portion of the kingdom is going to be torn away. Now, God had promised to David that he would establish his throne, and so there will always be a remnant left for the line of David. But there's only going to be a small portion. The rest of the nation is going to be taken away, and that takes place during the reign of Rehoboam. During Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, 10 tribes, the 10 northern tribes, they depart. And there's a story that you can go read. There's a lot of good lessons there in that story. But they depart, they make a man named Jeroboam their king, and they become the nation of Israel. And then you have left primarily the tribe of Judah and the very small tribe of Benjamin that make up the southern kingdom of Judah. And so from this point on, and this happens in the book of 2 Kings. So you've got 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel that tell us about Saul and David. 1 Kings tells us about Solomon. And so in 1 Kings, about chapter 12, is when you have a division. From that point on, when you read about Israel, you're normally reading about northern kingdom, and Judah is the southern kingdom. Now there were 19 rulers from the time of Jeroboam until the time that Israel went into captivity by Assyria. There were 19 kings, and not a single one of them was a righteous man. And it's really sad because some of them had some potential. Jeroboam had some incredible potential, but every single one of them ended up leading the nation into idolatry and immorality. Some of them were incredibly wicked, like Ahab, who was influenced by his wife Jezebel to go after the Baals and to begin practicing child sacrifice. And so Israel is never a righteous kingdom under these kings. And so finally, after about 210 years as a kingdom, they are essentially wiped out by Assyria, carried off into captivity, and they never really reform as a nation of Israel. There is still a remnant within those tribes, but they never become a nation of their own again. Judah fares a little bit better. They had 20 rulers. All of them were of the line of David. One thing you'll see in Israel's kings, you'll have a few kings, and then that king, because of their wickedness, that family will be wiped out, and a new family will become the reigning family, and then a new family. And well, in Judah, of course, all the kings are from the lineage of David. And they fared a little better. They had 20 kings. 8 of them were righteous men. Some of the men, like Hezekiah, are good and righteous men. So they last a little bit longer than Israel. They last about 325 years until their sin and their immorality and idolatry, of course, catches up to them also. And they are captivated. They are captured by Babylon. And that brings in the next era. And that is that captivity and exile era. Now, in the books of history, there's not a lot. There's a few chapters in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. We also learn some more from some of the books of prophecy about this time period, but not a whole lot of real estate is given to this time period per se. It lasted about 70 years. They're carried off into captivity into Babylon. There's 3 waves of deportation that Nebuchadnezzar leads. The city of Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed. So that grand, incredible temple, maybe one of the grandest buildings or the grandest building that has ever been built, was destroyed by Babylon. And you can just, what a tragedy that was, that the very building which was to be the presence of God ends up being destroyed, because even though there was the presence of God, the people rejected God's law. And so the city and the temple are destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So they're in captivity for 70 years, and then that brings us to the last era, and that is the return era. When the Medo-Persian kingdom conquers Babylon, the King Cyrus issues a decree allowing any Jews that want to return back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the city and to rebuild the temple. And so there were 3 waves of deportation into captivity, and there are 3 waves that we're told about of return back from Babylon and Persia back to Jerusalem. And those last 3 historical books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, really tell us about this time period. And you find some more stories like Daniel during the time period. Daniel takes place during this time period as well, or at least part of it. But there's a few men that we're told about. Ezra tells us about Zerubbabel. He leads the first return, and he is responsible for beginning the rebuilding of the temple. And so when the people go back, remember, they have no place to worship God as they used to, because the temple's destroyed, and so they have to rebuild the temple. Ezra, the second part of Ezra, tells us about Ezra's reforms, and he reestablishes proper worship. There's some incredible things in Ezra and Nehemiah. I really encourage you to read and study those books. Of course, Nehemiah leads a group of people back, and this is quite a while after Zerubbabel, but that is to rebuild the wall. The city of Jerusalem is being rebuilt, the temple's rebuilt, but the walls are in ruins, which exposes them to danger. And so Nehemiah goes back to help rebuild the walls. And of course, the story of Esther is kind of a side historical story, but another one of those beautiful stories, very unique story in the Old Testament. In fact, of all the books of the Bible, Esther, some people question whether Esther should be in the Bible or not. God is not mentioned in Esther at all, directly. But you can see the hand of God all throughout the book. And it's a beautiful book as it tells us the story of how the Jews are saved from genocide during this time period. And so that takes us all the way through the first 17 books of the Bible. And the thing is, when you get through those first 17 books of the Bible, you've covered the entire history of the Old Testament. Now, you've still got 22 books of the Bible to go, or of the Old Testament to go, but you've covered the history. All of those other books, so I don't know if you can read this chart very well. This represents those periods we've talked about. These are the historical books, the 5 books of law and the historical books. Everything else falls within this time frame. Of course, Job probably takes place early on. The Psalms really cover all of this period because Moses wrote one of the Psalms, and it's collected through the times of the kings. And then most of the books of prophecy take place during this time period of the kings. And then you have a few of the prophets that are written during the time period of the captivity or during the time period of the return. And so all the rest of the books of the Bible, they fit into those 17, into the time period that those first 17 books of the Bible cover. In fact, I know you probably won't be able to read this, but this just kind of looks at the timeline, and I can get you a picture of this if you want, of where those books of the Bible fall in the timeline of things. And so that's the outline. That's the eras of the Old Testament. Like I said, I hope that helps you kind of make sense of the outline of the history of the Old Testament. That's very, very basic, but it gives you a general story of what takes place from Genesis through the end of the historical time frame of the Old Testament. Of course, then there's going to be what we call the intertestamental period. There's a period of about 4 centuries where God is silent. God doesn't speak through any prophets until a man named John the Baptist comes on the scene. And of course, we begin reading about that in the New Testament, when the fullness of time, as Paul puts it in Galatians chapter 4, has come, and the Messiah, that all of this history has been looking forward to, all the promises, all the prophecies, all the sacrifices, all the types, all of those have been looking forward to Jesus the Messiah. But that's how the history plays out in the Old Testament. So I hope that's a helpful outline. Hope that interests you in maybe doing a little bit more study in the Old Testament on your own. Well, we don't want to close the service without offering an invitation. If there's someone here who has not obeyed the gospel and is not a Christian, then you have an opportunity tonight. If you believe in Jesus as the Son of God, and if you're ready to repent of your sins and confess Him as the Son of God, and if you're ready to obey Jesus by being baptized, then you can be added to the Lord's church by the Lord Himself. You can be washed of your sins, and we would love for you to make that choice. Or if you desire the prayers of the church for some reason, if you want to confess some fault or have us pray with you and for you, we'd be happy to assist you with that as well. So if there be one in need, please come while we stand and while we sing.